So in this section, we're going to see the change over time in Europe. We're going to look at the predominant religions, agricultural practices, and the political decentralization that's going to affect European society from 1200 to 1450. This is an exciting period, especially the High Middle Ages. See, as the Roman Empire fell in about 475 CE, European power declined during the 5th and 6th centuries, at least in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, it continued to flourish. But in Western Europe, they entered a period called the Middle Ages, sometimes also known as the Dark Ages or the medieval period. For this time period, everything shifts and changes. The Roman state is replaced by smaller kingdoms that frequently fought one another for controlled territory. I mean, they fought all the time, as I've said before, over everything. I mean, just anything could get them to fighting. In response, European kings, lords, and peasants worked out an agreement to provide for common defense because it was such a lawless, violent period in European history. Only the Roman Catholic Church remained powerful in most of Europe from the Roman times to the 16th century. However, between about 1000 CE to 1450, there was a revitalization of Europe in both learning and trade. This era is called the High Middle Ages, and during that period we start to see the rise of chivalry and the court of romantic love, which I'll get into later. Women begin to be put on pedestals rather than look, as before during the dark early period, women were considered to be, carry the sins of Eve and they were evil and blah, blah, blah. But anyways, in the High Middle Ages, they have like a shift in their roles. And they had a lot of power, actually more power than they're going to have when we move into the modern period. We also have the rise of philosophy like St. Thomas Aquinas. He was a monk and he wrote extensively over many subjects, but here's one of my favorite quotes, and I thought it was really appropriate for the time period. He said, "He who is not angry when there is just cause for anger is immoral." Why? Because anger looks to the good of justice. And if you can live amid injustice without anger, you are immoral as well as unjust. This section is going to look at European civilization in the Middle Ages. So it can't go without mention that some of the strongest women that we actually know about comes from this time period. See, women suffer in history from the same fate that a lot of minority cultures suffer from, and that is they weren't written about until after the 1960s. But after the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement, you start to see more history covered about not just women, but minorities and also just everyday people, rather than just always focusing on the heroes or the pseudo-heroes in history. So as a result, I picked one of the strongest women in history as our guest today. This is Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was a French duchess in her own right and the wealthiest woman in Europe. She married 2 kings. One of them she divorced and then married a second one. So not only will she be Queen of France, but she's also Queen of England. She goes on to have a prolific amount of children, all of whom turned out to be rather, oh, well, that's a whole other story. But anyways, very, very strong woman, knew her mind. She even is one of the rare women that went on a crusade, which we'll talk about later. So I wanted to introduce Eleanor of Aquitaine, and please feel free to look her up and see what she's about. All right, so this is a map of Europe approximately around the time of 1328, and you see just the vast amount of kingdoms. Certainly, we're going to look at just the western section of the empire right now, remembering, of course, that over here, where I'm circling, is the Byzantine Empire, which is where the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church will be. And it'll be its own, empire that will focus mostly on the East. In Europe, at least the Europe that we're talking about, we're going to focus first on the rise of England and Wales and look at them. And of course, we have France, and then different areas of Spain. And then the most important, not the most important, but certainly the most interesting is the Holy Roman Empire, which will later be Germany. I mean, this empire continues from about 900 CE really till 1815, when it changes and we see the unification of Germany. But for the most part, it was a loose confederation. It was supposed to be kind of be the successor to the Roman Empire. The Pope created it in order, actually, the Pope in Italy, here's the Pope down here, just circled that in the Papal States. The Pope created the Holy Roman Empire to give him an army. I mean, that was the problem. The Vatican didn't have a military, so he made a deal with a man named Otto, and King Otto, and he created him an emperor. And he said, as long as you'll protect me from over here, which is France and England and Spain, I'll make you an emperor. And he's like, cool, okay, let's do it. Right here, I kind of messed up, but that's the Habsburg territory. That'll continue to grow until they actually take over this whole area. But that's a whole different time period in Europe. So after we see all these circles, we see that we have many, many different kingdoms, and they're all marrying each other, and so you get the movement of brides from one place to the next, and they're all fighting over everything. You have a kingdom right here rise up in Italy, and we see that Italy remains ununified, so will Germany. So during this state building period after 1450, where France is becoming a kingdom, England's becoming a kingdom, Spain, Portugal, Italy and Germany will miss out on that. So feudalism was the result of this fall of the Roman Empire and this isolation. European civilization in the Middle Ages was characterized by a decentralized political organization based on a system of exchanges of land for loyalty. This was known as feudalism. Lacking a strong government, people needed some protection from pirates and bandits and rival noblemen and invaders such as the Vikings. The core of feudalism was a system of mutual obligations. So really summing it up, a monarch, usually a king, granted tracts of land called fiefs to his noblemen. In return, the nobleman provided the king with a military. The nobleman then took this land and provided it to knights in return for military service. These knights became vassals of the nobleman who was a vassal of the king. Nobles also provided land and protection to peasants. In return, peasants were obligated to farm the lord's land and provide the nobleman with crops and livestock and obey all of the nobleman's orders. This system at times could be cruel, especially for those on the bottom of the social pyramid, as you can see from the picture on your right. But feudalism did provide some security for peasants. It gave equipment for warriors and land to those who served the noblemen. Since the entire system was based on agriculture, wealth was measured in land rather than in cash, or rather than in people, as we saw in some West African kingdoms. The feudal system incorporated a code of chivalry, an unwritten set of rules for conduct, focusing on honor, courtesy, and bravery, as a way to resolve disputes. Some women were to be protected, The code put them on a pedestal while not investing them with any significant additional importance. In practice, women did not have many rights, but in some cases, as we'll see later on, they did lead armies, especially when their husbands were away. So the manor system was the way that life was organized during the Middle Ages and during feudalism. Large fiefs or estates were also referred to as manors. The manor system provided economic self-sufficiency and defense. The manor produced everything that people living on it required, limiting the need for trade or contact with outsiders. Many serfs spent their entire lives on a single manor, little aware of the events in the rest of Europe. Manor grounds were small villages that often included a church, a blacksmith shop, a mill, and wine presses. They included the homes of the peasants, known as serfs. Serfs, while not slaves, were tied to the land. This meant they could not travel without permission from the nobles, nor could they marry without the nobles' approval. In exchange for protection provided by the lord of the manor, they paid tribute in the form of crops, labor, or in rare cases, coins. Children born to serfs also became serfs. As both climate and technology slowly improved, the amount of arable or farmable land gradually increased. Agriculture became more efficient near the end of the Middle Ages. The three-field system in which crops were rotated through 3 fields came into use. One field was planted with wheat or rye, crops that provided food. A second field was planted with such things as peas, lentils, or beans. These made the soil more fertile by adding nitrogen to it. A third field was allowed to remain fallow or unused each year. Technological developments included windmills and new types of plows. Heavier plows with wheels worked well in dense soil north of the Alps, while lighter plows worked better in southern Europe. These changes then promoted population growth. During the later part of the Middle Ages, monarchies grew more powerful at the expense of the feudal lords. They did this by employing their own bureaucracy and building their own military. These employees now worked directly for the king or the queen. In contrast, in modern countries such as the United States, bureaucrats and soldiers work for the country, not the president. In the case of the Middle Ages, the land that these monarchs collected under their control, particularly in England and France, were beginning to look like the modern countries of Europe. So they were in the process of doing some state building. So at this time, France was smaller than the modern day country of France. England owned a large portion of it, but starting in under the rule of King Philip II, he was the first to develop a real bureaucracy. Yet it was not until Philip IV, who ruled from 1285 to 1314, that the first Estates General met. That is the famous parliament in France. The Estates General was a body that was designed to advise the king. It included representatives from each of the 3 legal classes or estates in France: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. Although the French kings consulted the Estates General when necessary, they did not exact regular taxes from the upper 2 estates, the clergy and the nobility. Consequently, the Estates General had little power. The clergy and nobility felt little responsibility to protect a government that they were not financing. And in general, that meant the commoners or everyone else, paid for the burden of the government. This is going to be a problem that is going to continue to increase in France all the way up to the eve of the French Revolution in 1789. Historians like to say of the Holy Roman Empire that it was not holy, neither was it Roman, nor was it an empire. So how did it get this designation? Well, the Pope gave it to them. The German king Otto I was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 962. And why was because the Pope didn't have a military, and so he made a deal with Otto. Otto's successors survived a power struggle with the papacy that's going to ensue. This was over something called lay investiture controversy. This dispute was over whether a king had the right to appoint a bishop, or was that the Pope who had that power? It was finally resolved in the Concordat of Worms in 1122 when the Church won, and they got to appoint the bishops. The Holy Roman Empire remained vibrant until it was virtually destroyed during the religious wars of the 30 Years' War in 1618 to 1648. It lingered on, but with very little power, and the empire came to a formal end when the French leader Napoleon invaded Central Europe in 1806. The Normans were descendants of Vikings who settled in northwestern France, a region known as Normandy. In 1066, a Norman king, William the Conqueror, successfully invaded England. This gave him kingdoms on both sides of the English Channel. He presided over a tightly organized feudal system using royal sheriffs as his administrative officials. The fusion of Normans and Anglo-Saxons created the modern English people. He went on to found a dynasty called the Angevin dynasty. His sons will go on to rule England under, you get William II, Henry I. You get a break in the monarchy and a small little civil war there, but they'll go on to rule for quite a while. Unfortunately, his great-great-grandson is John I of Robin Hood fame, and we're going to see that he's really the one that's going to cause a lot of problems. And yeah, let's look at him next. So John I of England, it's easy enough to say this about John I of England. He's really the only John of England. No other king will ever take the name of John. That is how bad he is. So we call him John I, but really, he's just King John. He's just fell into that trap of being a very weak king. And while being weak, he was also greedy. And that became a major problem. So by the time you get to 1215, many of the English nobles had objected to the power of the Norman monarchs. These nobles finally had enough and forced limits on that power. In 1215, they forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, which required the king to respect certain rights, such as the right to a jury trial before a noble could be sentenced to prison. They also won the right to be consulted on the issue of taxes. Finally, the first English Parliament was formed in 1265. These developments increased the rights of the English nobility, but not of the general population. The Magna Carta did not cover the commoners. In the first full parliamentary meeting in 1265, the House of Lords represented the nobles and the church hierarchy, while the House of Commons was made up of elected representatives of the wealthy townspeople. Eventually, the power of these two legislative bodies in England became stronger than that of the similar bodies on the European continent, and eventually they will replace the monarchy altogether. Between 1337 and 1453, the rival monarchies of England and France fought a series of battles known as the Hundred Years' War. English archers armed with longbows about 6 feet long helped win several early victories. However, by the end of the conflict, the English retained only the port of Calais in France. Two other important results of the war were on how people saw themselves and how they fought. On each side, serving under a monarch fostered a sense of unity among soldiers, who often spoke distinct languages or dialects. The war marked another step towards people identifying themselves as English or French rather than from a particular region. Also, the war demonstrated the spreading use of gunpowder weapons. Gunpowder had been invented by the Chinese and spread west by the Mongols. There were two areas in Europe that led to conflict between Christian and Muslims. One of them was Sicily. Sicily had been controlled by the Muslims for a long time, actually, and the Normans were going to move across and conquer it, taking control of that Mediterranean island, and also begin to control trade in that region. Muslims had also conquered Spain in the 8th century, and so starting, periodically through that period, Christians had wanted to reconquer it. This effort, called the Reconquista, occurred over many centuries. It was finally completed in 1492. In 1054, the Christian church in Europe divided into two branches, a split called the Great Schism. The Roman Catholic Church continued to dominate most of Europe for another 5 centuries, while the Orthodox Church was powerful further east from Greece to Russia. The Roman Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in Europe, divided into hundreds of small political states. Often, church staff were the only people in a community who knew how to read and write. If common people needed something written or read, they asked a church official to do it. Most manors had a small church and a priest on the grounds. Christianity provided people a shared identity, even as vernacular languages, once spoken by people in a region, emerged to replace Latin. The church established the first universities in Europe. Because the church led in the area of education, most philosophers, writers, and other thinkers of the Middle Ages were religious leaders. All artists worked for the church. Most artwork focused on religious themes, which provided images to help illiterate serfs understand the Bible. The church had great power in the feudal system. If a lord displeased the church, it could pressure the noble in various ways. For example, a local bishop might cancel religious services for his serfs. This angered the serfs, who would demand that the noble give in to the bishop. Like the Roman Empire, the Roman Catholic Church had an extensive hierarchy of regional leaders. The regional religious leaders, called bishops, owed allegiance to the Pope, the supreme bishop in Rome. The bishops also selected and supervised local priests. Although some Christian clergy withdrew to monasteries to meditate and pray, they remained part of the economies of Western Europe. The monasteries had the same economic functions of agriculture and protection as the manors. Women were permitted to become nuns and exerted their influence in the monasteries of the Catholic Church. Although clergy took vows of poverty and supported charities in their community, communities. The clergy also wielded considerable political influence, and some monasteries became quite wealthy. Wealth and political power led to corruption during the 13th and 14th centuries. Eventually, corruption as well as theological differences drove reformers such as Martin Luther to take a stand that would shatter the unity of the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century. Just as Europeans fought to drive Muslims out of Sicily and Spain, they also sought to reclaim the Holy Land. This was the region of Palestine in the Middle East that contains many sites of spiritual significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It also contains the holy city of Jerusalem. European Christians had been allowed there. I mean, they had been protected even under Muslim control, so they had access to these lands for many, many centuries. But by the 11th century, social and economic trends had changed in Europe. They had this rule called primogeniture, which meant that the eldest son inherited the entire estate, which left a generation of younger sons with little access to wealth or land. The landed nobles saw a military campaign as a way to divert the ambitions of these restless nobles, as well as unemployed peasants who often became bandits or pirates. And furthermore, merchants desired unfettered access to trade routes through the Middle East. Also, the Pope encouraged us to keep, the countries in Europe from fighting each other. The combination of these religious, social, and economic pressures resulted in the Crusades, a series of European military campaigns in the Middle East between 1095 and the 1200s. Politics shaped the conduct of the Crusades. Tensions between popes and kings strengthened the intention of the Roman Catholic Church to take control. The Church also used its spiritual authority to recruit believers. It granted relief from required acts of atonement and penance, and even promised people they would reach heaven sooner if they joined a crusade. Support came from the Orthodox branch of Christianity as well. Alarmed by news of the persecution of Christian pilgrims by the Seljuk Turks, the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople appealed to Pope Urban II to help retake the Holy Land from Islamic control. Of the four major crusades, only the first was a clear victory for Christendom. The European army conquered Jerusalem in July of 1099. However, Muslim forces under Saladin regained control of Jerusalem in 1187. The Crusades did promote cultural exchange between Europe and the Middle East. The Middle East had a higher standard of living, and European crusaders increased the demand for Middle Eastern goods. During the fourth and last major crusade, which was 1202 to 1204, Venice, a wealthy city-state in northern Italy, had a contract to transport crusaders to the Middle East, an area known as the Levant. However, Venice was not paid all of what was due, so the Venetians persuaded the crusader debitors first to sack Zara, an Italian city, and then Constantinople, a major trade competitor of Venice and a Christian city. The Fourth Crusade never made it to the Holy Land. They were too busy looting Christian cities. Eventually, Islamic forces prevailed in the Levant. The Crusades were just part of the changes occurring in Europe in the late Middle Ages. Local economic self-sufficiency in Europe gradually gave way to an interest in goods and ideas from other European areas and from far-flung ports. In the late 13th century, Marco Polo, an Italian native from Venice, visited the court of Kublai Khan in China. Marco Polo's captivating descriptions of the customs of the people he met intrigued Europeans. For example, he described how Mongols had multiple marriages, drank mare's milk, burned black stones, which turned out to be coal, to heat their homes, and bathed frequently, often 3 times per week. Oh my goodness, yeah, leave it to a European to be shocked by that. Curiosity about Asia skyrocketed, stimulating interest in mapping and adopting these new ideas. Growth in long-distance trade changed the social pyramid of Western Europe. Economic success started to rival religious vocation or military service in winning status. Elite nobles and clergy and the mass of peasants began to grow. This is known as, and then also, the middle class began to grow, known as the bourgeoisie. It included shopkeepers, merchants, craftspeople, and small landowners. With renewed trade came larger cities. The change to the three-field system and other advances in agriculture led to population growth in the late Middle Ages. This agricultural surplus encouraged the growth of towns and of markets that could operate more frequently than just on holidays. As the demand for more labor on the manors increased, the supply decreased. A series of severe plagues swept through Eurasia in the 14th century. In Europe, an outbreak of bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, killed as many as 1/3 of the population. The growing demand for labor and the deaths of so many people gave serfs more bargaining power with the lords. Urban growth was hampered after the 1300s by a 5-century cooling of the climate known as the Little Ice Age. Lower temperatures reduced agricultural productivity, so people had less to trade and cities grew more slowly. The Little Ice Age led to an increase in disease and an increase in unemployment. These in turn created social unrest. The crime rate increased, and Jews and Muslims and other groups that already faced discrimination were the victims of scapegoating, being blamed for something over which they had no control. During the Middle Ages, the small Jewish populations in Christian Europe began to grow. Many Jews lived in Muslim areas in the Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain and Portugal, and around the Mediterranean Sea when these areas were overtaken by European Christians. In time, Jews who could afford to move northward in Europe did so. Some political leaders, particularly in Amsterdam and other commercial cities, welcomed them since they brought valuable experience in business and trade. The Roman Catholic Church also had a policy that Christians could not charge interest on loans to other Christians. However, Jews were not bound by this restriction. With few other economic opportunities, many Northern European Jews became moneylenders. The resulting increase in the flow of money contributed to the economic growth of Europe. However, anti-Jewish sentiment or anti-Semitism was widespread among Christians. They thought of Jews as outsiders and untrustworthy. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, France in 1394, Spain in 1492, and Portugal in 1497, as well as from various independent kingdoms and cities in Northern and Central Europe. Jews expelled from Western and Central Europe often moved to Eastern Europe. While Jews had lived in this region since the 1st century, their numbers increased greatly because of these expulsions. Like Jews, Muslims faced discrimination in Europe. In 1492, the Spanish king expelled the remaining Muslims in the kingdom who would not convert to Christianity. Many Muslims moved to southeastern Europe. In the 13th century, the Muslim Ottoman Empire expanded its reach from Turkey into the Balkan countries of present-day Albania, Kosovo, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. These countries developed large Muslim populations. While Europe was predominantly Christian, and despite their persecution, both Jews and Muslims helped shape society. Unlike most people in Europe in the Middle Ages, Jews lived in urban areas, and they served as a bridge between Christians and the Muslims whose goods they desired in trade. Contacts with traders and Muslim caliphates opened up a world of trade and a world of ideas for Europeans who had long been self-sufficient and isolated under feudalism. Women found their rights eroding as a wave of patriarchal thinking and writing accompanied the movement from an agricultural society to a more urban one. Even fewer women than men received an education. One place where women had greater opportunities to display their skills in administration and leadership was in religious orders. Some women also became artists and members of guilds, although not all had property rights. Women in Islamic societies tended to enjoy higher levels of equality, particularly in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. Our story time today involves a woman named Isabella, Queen of England, or most commonly known as Isabel of France, or sometimes she's called the She-Wolf of France. Basically, Isabella married the King of England, Edward II. She was 12 years old when she married Edward. And, she was from France, came over to England, and immediately her new husband was notorious for lavishing his love on, his male favorites, we'll say that. As a result, she was neglected, but she knew her role. Her role was to have a child, and she did. And actually, her son is going to be one of the most famous of medieval kings. His name was Edward III. But right now she's married to Edward II. He's not famous and he's weak. And actually, the fact that he preferred men was not really a problem during the Middle Ages. I mean, I'm sure the church didn't really, support it, but it really wasn't a problem. As long as you were a warrior, nobody really cared what you did in your personal life. But that was the problem with Edward, is that he wasn't a warrior. And he began to lose all these wars. He lost a war with Scotland, then he lost territory in France, and he kept losing more and more territory of France. I mean, later on, his son, Edward III, will go on to take it back. But he is losing, and that is something that the English nobility can never forgive a medieval king of England. Now we have Isabella. She stays married to Edward. I mean, they stay married about 20 years. It takes them a while to have a child. It's not till later in their marriage that they have their son, and they'll only, have this. Oh, no, they go on to have a few other children, actually, but it will be later on. And so, 20 years down the line, she's absolutely sick of it. And Edward made a big mistake, and that is he began to take her territory and her jewelry and give it to his boyfriends. That was something she wouldn't take. And plus, she'd been lonely and bored. And frankly, there was this hot guy at court named the Duke of Mortimer. And the Duke of Mortimer did not like the fact that the king had favorites and kept giving his favorites land. And so suddenly, next thing you know, Isabel and Mortimer are like a thing. And now I'm getting a little too slang here. But what I mean is they form a relationship and decide to have a revolution. And first things don't go well and they have to flee to France. France is her home. That's where her brother is now king. And there she's able to raise an army. And there's something you have to understand. It's very difficult to invade an army or an island. And England is an island. Same with Japan. Hard to invade. England's an island as well. Only, I mean, they've had some invasions. I'm not going to lie. But it's not easy. And so she raises an army with her boyfriend Mortimer, who is, a member of the nobility. And remember, Edward had insulted most of his nobility. So all she has to do is land in England, and then suddenly all the nobles are going to flock to her, and that's what she does. She lands in England with her army, starts marching towards London, because you got to take London, and nobles and their military, and this is the Middle Ages, so the nobles controlled the military, flock to her. She takes over in the name of her son, Edward III, but Edward was not 18 yet, so he couldn't rule on his own. So she claims herself regent. The problem with Isabella was she was haughty and stuck up. She had every right to be, honestly. Her mother was a queen of her own right. She was the Queen of Navarre, and then her father was the King of France. So she was actually descended from two rulers, not just a queen that married a king, but her mother ruled in her own right. So she was very haughty and proud and kind of offended everybody. So that was her main problem. The other problem was probably that she murdered her husband. And here's the deal with that. She takes over the kingdom, her and her boyfriend do, in the name of their son, or her son, Edward III. And when she does this, she has her husband, Edward II, thrown in prison. Now, he's got to go. You can't leave a king in place when you've just overthrown the country, you've just invaded. He has to go, but she can't kill him. She can't have him publicly executed. So she decides, and this is just a theory, but it's the most fun one, that he has to be killed by not leaving a mark. So she orders a red-hot poker to be inserted in his bottom until it pierced the inside of his intestines. And basically this is called impaling. She had him impaled so that he could die leaving no mark. And he did. He died. Now, the story doesn't go well for Isabella because, as I said, she was proud. And so in the end, the rulers, the nobles, overthrew her, set up a kind of a committee to rule for her son until he came of age. But once he came of age, he took over and ruled and had a golden era in English history. I would like to end that in the end, she's surrounded by her grandchildren, so she doesn't receive any punishment. Her boyfriend, on the other hand, lost his head. So she was kind of sent to some of her castles and her land, and she was able to enjoy a relationship with her son and her grandchildren. But poor Mortimer, he had to go. And that's the story. Oh, and by the way, like I've said many times, women can do anything, including invade a country, murder their husband, take over for a short time, and then retire nicely to a castle to be surrounded by the love of the grandchildren. I don't recommend the first two things, but certainly the last one sounds nice. The expansion of trade, the growth of agricultural surplus, and the rise of a middle class able to patronize artists sparked great creativity in Europe. The Renaissance was a period characterized by a renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman literature, art, culture, and civic virtue. Scholars recovered and studied decaying manuscripts that had been written many centuries earlier. In 1439, Gutenberg's movable type printing press started a print technology revolution. The printing press allowed manuscripts to be mass-produced at affordable costs. It fostered a growth in literacy and the rapid spread of ideas. One characteristic of the Renaissance was the interest in humanism, the focus on individuals rather than God. Humanists sought education and reform. They began to write secular literature. Cultural changes in the Renaissance, such as the increased use of the vernacular language propelled the rise of powerful monarchies, the centralization of governments, and the birth of nationalism. During the late Middle Ages in Eastern Europe, extensive trade in furs, fish, and grain connected people from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The city-state at the center of this trade was Kievan, Russia, based on what is today Kiev, Ukraine. Because it adopted the Orthodox Christian Church, it maintained closer cultural relationship with Byzantium in Constantinople rather than the Roman Catholic Church in Europe. In the 13th century, everything changed. The Mongols overtook the region. They were called the Golden Horde, so it developed even more separately from the rest of Europe. The Mongols required local nobles to collect taxes for them. As these nobles grew wealthy in their role, they began to resist Mongol rule. In the late 15th century, under the leadership of a Moscow-based ruler known as Ivan the Great, the region became independent of the Mongols. This marked the beginning of the modern state of Russia. So as one can see, Europe experienced massive change over the period of 1200 to 1450. Europe in 1200 was an area of decentralized feudal kingdoms with little contact with the world beyond the manor. Europe in 1450, on the other hand, was a region of agricultural abundance, growing towns and cities, increasing trade with other parts of the world, growing commerce, and centralizing states. The roles of women will decline, and so will the roles of minorities in this region as they suffer more and more intolerance. And that is the conclusion of Europe from 1200 to 1450. Good job.